At 2:10 on 17 August 2021, a reserve gate in South Australia opened. 40 greater bilbies vanished into a barren desert, and what began growing along their tracks would leave the rangers struggling to explain how such small animals had revived land that years of human work could not. Subscribe, there are more of these comeback stories than you'd believe. Under the floodlights, wooden carriers sat in a row beside the release gate. One door lifted. A pair of long ears appeared, then a pointed face and two black eyes. The first bilby sprang onto the dust, paused for half a breath, and vanished into the dark. The others followed. Within minutes, all that remained were empty boxes, faint claw marks, and 40 radio pulses moving away through the spinifex. The rangers expected hunger to stop them. This ground looked empty even by desert standards. Wind had polished the bare patches hard, and years of careful restoration had produced little more than scattered tufts. The team feared that the bilbies would search, find too little food, and slowly disappear. Survival was the easy part. The real mystery was the new growth appearing behind them, and the odds had never been comfortable. The founder group contained just 18 males and 22 females. Each wore a small radio transmitter. Beyond the predator fence, feral cats still moved through the night, silent and patient. A damaged wire or an open gate could turn one hunting cat into a disaster. Imagine watching those 40 signals on a screen, knowing that every one that falls silent could change the fate of the experiment. So the tracking staff listened. At dawn, they walked towards each pulse with a receiver held before them, following soft electronic beeps across wind-hardened sand. Sometimes they found a burrow entrance. Sometimes only tracks. Then they began finding fresh conical bilby pits in places where a tagged animal had stopped once during the night and apparently never returned. The pits were small enough to step over. Each looked like a neat scoop taken from the earth, with loose grains fanned behind it. Nothing about them seemed dramatic. Yet when the staff checked those locations several weeks later, tiny seedlings were rising inside the old diggings. Smooth ground nearby remained bare. The green shoots had gathered in the hollows with almost unsettling accuracy. Look closely at the hollow beneath those green shoots, because that small scoop of sand is where the mystery begins. Was a pit sheltering seed from the wind? Had it caught water, leaf scraps, or something carried on the bilby's paws? At that stage, the team could not say. They knew only that the pattern followed the animals, and that untouched sand was not producing the same response. I'm Peter, and this is the full story of 40 little animals that walked into an empty landscape and started building it again. It leads through the bilby's collapse, the hidden science inside one scoop of sand, and the survey that finally proved the desert had changed. To understand what the rangers were seeing, look at the animal itself. A greater bilby is lightly built, with long ears, a narrow muzzle, and forelegs far stronger than its delicate frame suggests. Its claws rake through packed earth in search of termites, bulbs, and fungi. Sand flies beneath its belly. Even its backward opening pouch is made for this work, keeping loose soil from being thrown over the young as their mother digs. That makes the bilby more than a creature seeking shelter and food. It is an ecosystem engineer. Every night, it cuts openings into a surface that wind and heat have sealed. Each visit leaves a pocket where loose earth replaces the crust, and where a root might gain its first thin hold. But a useful digging habit is not yet a restored landscape. The seedlings had selected the bilby's conical pits with uncanny precision. But one question remained unanswered. Could 40 diggers make enough of those small hollows to change an entire desert? To answer that, you have to look beneath those small hollows where roots begin, because the ground around them had been losing the same quiet battle for generations. Grazing livestock, rabbits, and introduced predators had worked upon the land in different ways. Hooves pressed loose soil into a hard crust. Rabbits clipped new growth close to the stem. Introduced cats and foxes hunted bilbies until they vanished across much of their former Australian range. The damage then began feeding itself. Rain struck the compacted surface and slid away. Seed lying in the open was carried off by the next dry wind. Any young plant that did emerge faced a rabbit before its roots reached damp soil below. Pour water onto that crust in your mind. You can see it escape before a root has any chance to drink. The desert still received rain and seed. It simply could not hold either for long enough. Rangers tried to help it hold on. They dragged metal teeth through bare patches to cut artificial furrows. They walked those lines, scattering native seed by hand, then laid dead branches across the sand as shelter. For a while, the marks looked convincing. Parallel grooves crossed the plain. Seeds rested in their shade. Then the wind returned, filled the furrows, and buried the branches until much of that careful pattern disappeared. Here is the part most people have never heard. The desert did not need to be made tidy. It needed to be made messy. Ecologists call this habitat heterogeneity. In plain language, it means breaking one uniform surface into many different little places. A conical bilby pit does precisely that. Its steep sides cut through the crust. Its hollow catches leaf litter, dung, and seed that would otherwise skim over the ground. Suddenly, the seedlings clustering in those one-visit pits begin to make sense. But the pit does more than catch things. When rain falls, water pauses inside it instead of racing across the plain. A deeper burrow lifts cool, mineral-rich soil into the sunlight. Fungi travel on a bilby's pores and pass through its droppings. Once deposited in damp earth, those fungi form fine threads around plant roots and help them reach water beyond their own grasp. Moisture, seed, nutrients, and fungi meet inside one protected pocket. The clusters were no coincidence. Each pit was a tiny assembly point, built during an ordinary search for supper. A bilby drives its foreclaws into the sand after termites, bulbs, and fungi, throwing soil behind it in quick, pale sprays. Over time, one animal can turn over tons of earth. That sounds immense until you stand at the predator fence and look across the reserve. A few busy patches can still disappear inside that much country. The capacity question had only grown sharper. Would all this digging ever register as a pattern across the landscape? If this sounds almost too simple, that is precisely what made the next survey so unsettling. The intervention was to remove cats and foxes, maintain the predator fence, and return the original builder. Then the rangers stopped arranging every patch of sand by hand. They checked the transmitters and followed the silent radio signals through the dark. Beyond that, they waited while bilbies dug where instinct led them, with no map of the restoration lines and no interest in human plans. Seasons passed over the monitoring stakes. Wind shifted the dunes. Rain briefly darkened the conical bilby pits, then vanished beneath them. When the second annual vegetation team finally laid its grid across the reserve, 3 measurements would decide whether those pits were isolated curiosities or the beginning of a living landscape. The number of active diggings, the density of seedlings, and the hectares turning green. The measuring tapes went down at first light, pulled tight across the monitoring grid until the desert became a series of neat squares. Rangers moved through them on their knees. At every numbered conical pit, a field notebook opened. Every shoot was counted. Every patch of disturbed soil was matched against an untouched plot nearby, where the surface remained hard, flat, and almost bare. Before you hear the count, picture 40 small animals against all that empty ground. The team recorded 1,846 active foraging pits. That figure changed the scale of the experiment. The bilbies had not simply dug a few shelters near the fence. Night after night, their claws had carried the work across the reserve. Each search for a termite or buried bulb left another pocket in the crust. One animal made a hollow. Rain and wind filled it. Then the next animal dug farther on. But the count alone could not prove that anything was recovering. For that, the rangers had to lower their eyes to the seedlings. Inside the disturbed patches, seedling density was 3.7 times higher than on untouched ground. Side by side, the difference was almost rude. One square held loose earth, crowded with green stems. The control square beside it looked like an old clay floor. The pits had become traps, but useful ones. They caught seed that would otherwise have blown away. They held damp leaf litter against the soil. A brief shower settled inside them, instead of sliding across the packed surface. What began as a bilby hunting for supper had become a nursery by morning. Then the survey widened beyond the individual pits. Native grasses had spread across 26 hectares without another ranger scattering seed. Thin blades moved in the wind, where the restoration crews had once watched their hand-cut furrows disappear. Damp litter gathered beneath them. Insects entered that cover. Small reptiles followed the insects, paused between the stems, and left droppings that returned still more nutrients to the ground. The desert was beginning to feed its own recovery. The full answer waited at the original release gate. Rangers walked back to the place where the animals had first vanished into darkness and looked out across the plain. Green islands now traced the bilbies' nightly routes. They ran away from the gate in broken lines, joining pit to pit, each patch showing where paws and claws had disturbed the earth. That was what grew, and that was why the rangers were stunned. The bilbies had carried no seed bags. They had planted no garden. They had rebuilt the conditions that allowed water, seed, fungi, insects, and grass to assemble one for themselves. The smallest marks in the sand had become the working parts of a landscape. They are not merely living in the desert. They are building it. I want to be honest about what this story does not solve. And this matters because wonder should never require us to look away from the limits. A fence is not a continent. Drought can still erase young growth before its roots reach deeper moisture. Beyond protected ground, introduced predators can turn a bilby's nightly search into its last. Recovery requires watchful fences, patient people, and long protection, as well as wonder. There is another thread here, quieter than the survey figures. Bilby comes from an Aboriginal language of inland Australia. The word endured in everyday speech while the animal disappeared from vast stretches of country. People kept saying its name in places where its tracks, burrows, and long ears could no longer be found. Now the animal is moving back beneath that old name. After sunset, it noses through the grass and drives its claws into the soil. Sand passes beneath its backward opening pouch. Behind it remain small hollows where roots can begin. The word has its animal again, and the land has recovered one of its oldest workers. Perhaps restoration is sometimes less about improving nature than returning the missing hands that once performed the work. At the release gate, those hands are small, furred, and mostly hidden by night. Yet the green islands around them are plain enough. Give the original builder room, and a barren place may remember how to build itself. Tell me in the comments which Australian ecosystem engineer we should follow next. And subscribe, because there are more of these comeback stories than you'd believe. Thanks for watching.